Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back for our last general session of the day. And we are going to talk about cooking up a story and picking the right recipes. So basically, we're going to talk about how chefs and media can work together to be agents of change. And joining me on stage, from stage right, I guess, or stage left, I never know which side is which, first is Jane Black, a food writer who covers sustainability, food politics, and trends for the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal, among many others. Jane is currently working on a book about a West Virginia town's struggle to change the way it eats and whether the food revolution can cross geographical, cultural, and class boundaries. Jane Black. And joining her next is Sarah Nassauer, who's the retail and consumer trends reporter for the Wall Street Journal, whom you met earlier. Sarah. And Kim Severson, Atlanta bureau chief for the New York Times, whom you met this morning.
It's a long stage to have to walk across.
I felt like it was like a beauty pageant.
Do you want to sit in the middle?
No, I'm good like that. Okay. This is my better side. All right, so how did vegetables become such a sexy story?
Because they're delicious.
No, I live in the South, and I have been there for about 4.5 years when the Southern food thing sort of took off in a way, and I think that was very interesting. We have chefs down there who are like real vegetable whisperers who really, South is a very agrarian history. I always like to call it the Italy of the South, Italy of America in a way, because it's very regional, and how someone cooks their collards in one county will different from another county, and people have big discussions about that. And I think there was this, I think I blame the South in some ways. I think that the idea of the vegetable plate and of cooking vegetables rose with the rise of Southern cuisine. So I think that's one reason. The Jerusalem cookbook's probably another reason. I mean, I think it's because people just started making it delicious. I don't know.
I think it's a counterintuitive thing. I think it's that, vegetables were always eat your vegetables. It was an obligation, right? And then people like Amanda, we saw cook today, and all kinds of people started to give them the respect they deserve, and people sort of thought, oh, well, that's cool. I mean, a truly delicious carrot. And then, of course, there was the follow-up story, which was, oh my God, they just charged me $28 for a carrot, and then, on and on and on. So it was just sort of new.
And you can't have a farm-to-table movement without stuff.
Well, because then there's nothing seasonal about it.
Because it can't all just be beef to table,
Right. We could.
Right. So.
What about your perspective on that, Sarah?
I think about the long history of that question, because my mother, I know she always used to talk about, my mother has an extensive vegetable garden in her yard in Michigan, and she grew up eating mostly canned vegetables in Iowa. And she talked about, when I was a kid, you didn't like vegetables because they didn't taste that good, because they were from a can in December, or even in the summer sometimes. And, from that, you follow the availability of produce, going back a few decades now, and then move from there to where we are today. I think in the more recent past, we're at a point where vegetables are something that we all at least know that we should be eating more of, and you have that mandate, you have that in your head, you're putting that in your kid's head, and things grow from there.
And I also think that you can discount Alice Waters in this conversation as much as, she's easy to make fun of, and, Alice, but truly the idea of trying to get a whole army of children who would grow their own vegetables and eat kale, and it really actually does work. And I think that you've got a generation of kids who are now coming up who have started to have that culinary education in school and that gardening education based on gardening. And so they're relating to vegetables in ways. So I think that's feeding it as well, too, because their parents then have to think about vegetables.
But I will say some of this is a wish, right? Statistically still, as we all know, there's a lot of meat that is eaten, and that's still center of the plate in lots of people's homes and in a lot of restaurants and all of that. Some of this is aspirational still for a certain percentage of the population, or even for, certain meals, right? You want to eat more vegetables, or you're trying to eat more vegetables and fruit. I think it's that aspiration that, to me, that's interesting. We're sort of on the cusp of something, perhaps.
Don't you think it's globalization too, though, of our diets? And so other cultures, we're cooking from other cultures that aren't putting meat at the middle of the plate.
Right. I also just, in terms of aspirational thing, I was just thinking about aspirational, getting kids to eat vegetables, because as some of you have probably heard me tell this story, I have a 3.5-year-old, and she's, it's like this karmic joke that I got the kid that doesn't want to eat anything. And I grew all these tomatoes, because if you grow them, then they'll eat them. That is actually not true, as it turns out. And then by sort of hook or by crook, because, in Brooklyn, I live in Brooklyn, so, you have to have a tattoo. So they have vegetable tattoos now for kids. And so I made her put this tomato tattoo on, and she looked at me very seriously, and she said, "Mama, I like the tomato tattoo, but I don't like tomatoes." So, I mean, for me, the jury is still out on whether this stuff really works or not, but it makes it interesting to write about.
Mother of the Year, right?
Yes, get your kids tattoos.
Get your kids tattoos. It doesn't work.
She bought him a pack of Lucky Strikes and a tattoo.
Yeah. They were vegetable-based dyes.
Come here, kid. Let me give you your tomato tattoo.
Sarah, something that you said about the aspirational, and we're still trying to eat a certain amount of produce, and I think some of the scientific presentations have made that clear, that we're still, as a whole, however sexy carrots and Brussels sprouts are, we're still very much in that aspirational of, well, I'm still trying to meet a certain quota. So in terms of the stories you write, how much is it about nutrition? How much is it about food policy? How much is it about just good food or flavor when you're talking about plant-based dishes?
I think there's a balance, right, that a lot of companies and research, a lot of people are trying to find, because everyone acknowledges that this is the goal. Look at juicing and smoothies. I love that example, because basically we found a way to eat our vegetables, eat our fruit, in a way that we find acceptable, which is by drinking it. And smoothies are booming, frozen fruit sales, that were like just sort of middling for years, are booming for that reason, because we can puree them and suck them down in a straw and kids will eat them. So I think, there's this balance that people are trying to find, like how do I still sell people this thing on the menu or something on a shelf or in the produce aisle, and make sure that it's something that the customer at least feels good about. So I think you see a lot of people playing with the balance of those things. How do I appeal to public health policy, and that's pressuring me, right, as a company? How do I appeal to my family and get the food on the table and make sure and feel good about what they're eating and they eat it and feel happy? How do I spend the money that I want to spend? All those things. It's a balancing act, is my sense.
Oh, I think one thing driving the vegetable thing, though, that people don't realize is the healthcare insurance crisis. And I think that increasingly it's getting to this point where people are having to take the responsibility for healthcare into their own hands. And so you're not going to just assume that you'll go to the doctor and feel better because it's going to be so expensive for your deductible. And I think there's this thing where we're turning to this idea of self-care in this country because the healthcare system is in such crisis. And part of that is like, well, maybe I better think about drinking a smoothie I guess I just can't be doing what I used to do. It's sort of the same way that, like smoking or even getting there was just this sense that I have to take some personal responsibility for making myself healthy because the healthcare system's not gonna, my doctor's not gonna fix it. I was of the generation where you were sick, you went to the doctor but that's not so available for people anymore, particularly because of the cost. So I think as culturally we turn to self-care instead of healthcare system, this idea of vegetables, where it's like, okay, this is medicine for me and I need to eat it. It's not like, oh, you should eat your vegetables because your mother should. It's not like the nagging nation. It's actually like, I better save my ass nation. I think that's affecting things. But that's a technical term. I don't want to, go over your head. Yeah.
So Brussels sprouts have had their moments. I think it kind of peaked when, because it was such a friendly vegetable to pair with bacon. And so the two trends kind of hit. And hit a peak together, and then kale had its moments, cauliflower steaks have been really big, carrots are the it vegetable of the moment, I think, and smoothies, salads, etc. There's all these things, green juices that have helped contribute to making them trendy. So what are chefs doing now with plants, grains, vegetables, fruits that make them newsworthy for you?
Or cooking food trends?
I'm like, that's a good question.
Yeah,
Well, I think
I don't know. There's not an easy answer to that.
Right. Where's the watercress lady? Watercress is the new kale. That's what she was doing.
Right.
I think, again, the impact of that Jerusalem cookbook and those guys is big. So I think you're going to see a lot of, I think, eggplants and grains and North African, Middle Eastern cooking, stuff from Saudi. I think all of that is kind of a big thing right now, Persian food to a degree, because I think there's that ancient grain feel to them. Ancient grains are kind of I don't even know what that means really, but like I love that I would be eating ancient grains. That sounds good to me.
But don't you think that part of it is the new, but part of it is the things you didn't used to like? I mean, Brussels sprouts were hot because it was like, no one likes Brussels sprouts, and oh my God, these are amazing, and I want to pay $17 for Brussels sprouts. And, I think eggplant is the next one for that reason, because people, they like eggplant, but then you make it at home, and it's greasy, and it's slimy, and it's just, even me, who, I consider myself a really good cook, I get a little nervous about eggplant. And so I think, you start to see this, it's that reinvent the something, that thing that they used to make you eat. Now it's just so great. So I think that's a way that people have made things sexy. I mean, at a certain point, we're going to run out of vegetables that people don't like. Radishes, maybe radishes
I think
are
we'll
next.
go all the way back to potatoes.
Right,
eventually.
right.
Potatoes will be
We'll
the
come
new kale.
full circle.
Right.
Potatoes is the new kale. There you go.
So is it part of, and Amanda on her website says that leave the vegetables to the pros, basically. So is that what it is? Is it that chefs are able to take these ingredients that are ultimately the things you see in the supermarket every day and prepare them in a more interesting manner than home cooks can? Or is it that simple?
That's part of it, I think, as a eater. I think that's true.
It depends how your standards are. Like, I was watching her make that tomato tart, and I was thinking, I would never make that. I would be extremely happy if somebody would make that for me. And I think vegetables, to reach that, Michelin-starred level require a little more attention, a little more labor. And I thought that was interesting in one of the panels today. They were talking about I think it was Amanda actually that was talking about how labor-intensive vegetables are. And so it's interesting to me in terms of the food service industry, vegetables are so hot, but if they're so labor-intensive, there's almost a limit to how high their star can rise unless people start hiring a lot more people, which is probably why they just throw them in the blender and make it into a smoothie. But I think that, it is labor-intensive to sort of do all of that stuff. I mean, on the other hand, I can make a pretty delicious roasted cauliflower in 5 minutes and put it in the oven, and then I don't have to do anything. So I think it's a question of what level of culinary technique you're talking about. I mean,
what your expectation
right,
of yourself is.
right.
I think there's some parallels with seafood on that one. It's, there's a little bit of an unknown. How do I cook it? How do I make it really good? Should I risk it? That kind of thing with cooking vegetables for people.
But risking a $26 a pound snapper versus,
different.
A couple of eggplants is I think vegetables are fairly inexpensive for people compared to, to seafood. But you cannot discount the crazy internet trend effect on vegetables. Like I think about the cauliflower pizza crust with the gluten-free thing. And you could not, swing a gluten-free Brooklynite without hitting that cauliflower pizza recipe for a while, where you pulse it down and make it into a pizza crust. And it's a phenomenon that because people do want to cook better, and I think people are cooking more. I think that's the other thing that we certainly notice that at the times we just really, like someone said before, really doubling down on recipes. And you have this generation of people who grew up with all the people who had to learn how to cook through the Food Network, and the people who learned to cook from 30-minute Rachel Ray because their moms were going into the workforce, and cooking sort of fell out of favor. The whole generation didn't know how to cook, and they learned to cook through Food Network, and then we had this explosion. So millennials are cooking like crazy, and they're very interested in preserving, pickling, there's roasting okra, and I think there's a real tangible, and again, I think it's an analog reaction to a digital world. It's a part of the technological revolution. People really want to do things that they can touch and feel, and vegetables are part of that cookery. The idea of cooking them, growing them, buying them. It's kind of a slow process, pickling with vegetables, or learning to cook vegetables, taking the time to know how to learn each one. So I think we're in a real cooking revolution right now for home cooks, particularly for younger home cooks. So I think that's really contributes to the rise in vegetable cookery right now, and I think will help the cause of this group's intention in a big way.
I just want to add something to that, because I think it's true, but I haven't quite figured this out, and there's probably a story in it, but there's sort of millennials and millennials. You've got these millennials in Chicago and San Francisco and New York, and they're part of all these trends. And then, my book, Anne mentioned, is about West Virginia, so I spent a long time in West Virginia, and I can assure you that the millennials there are not making cauliflower rice, nor, for that matter, have they even connected that food and health. I mean, there is still an expectation among a large number of Americans that if you have diabetes, you go on medication. It's shocking, but it's really true. And, my favorite headline from the last month, this isn't particular to vegetables, but it impacts sort of all of these rising trends. And I say it only to caution food service people who might try to go too fast for the mainstream market, was the Pizza Hut headline, that they were, artisan hadn't really worked out for them, and they were therefore going to start putting hot dogs in the pizza crust. Part of it's, that's a good laugh line, but it's very true. Changing tastes, even among young people, it's a long process. It's a big education process.
And so how, as media, can you contribute to that? Because I think it's obviously the people who go to Dirt Candy are people who are, for the most part, seeking vegetables and who want that. But one of the things that we hear over and over again from you all in the audience when we're doing surveys or talking, it's so hard to change consumers' minds, and that's come up over and over again in sessions. So how? And part of that is this question of value. Vegetables are not worth as much as meat, even though the labor is much more intensive. So what can you do? What can you write? Or do you have a responsibility to help change consumers' mindsets?
No. We don't. I don't think that's how we see it. I know I'm disappointing. I've said this a few times today. No, we don't approach our jobs that way. We have an obligation, or what we do is we write about things that are interesting or fascinating, and as the trend turns that way, which I think it really is, we write those stories, but I don't think we approach the story like, let's push it along. That's just not how we see it. Though I think in the end, this idea of sort of how far has this gone, and this idea that, okay, there are lots of people that aren't thinking about, they want hot dogs on their crust, I think is really interesting. And this, there was a few talks today that talked about sort of nudging people in subtle ways toward this that I think is really interesting. We all know that taste is really important with food, and it has to taste good. In many cases, it needs to be inexpensive, or at least some of the time. And people might start to eat more of those things. Someone can both like a Pizza Hut pizza with mini hot dogs in the crust one day and say, I want to eat vegetarian Indian food the next day. And I think it's that gradual shifting of eating occasions that is probably how this is going to play out.
Who wants an artisan Pizza Hut pizza? I want a Pizza Hut pizza that tastes like a freaking Pizza Hut pizza, I think some things you just can't force, and I think class has a lot to do with it, obviously,
It has a huge amount to do with it, and I think it's, it's also, but it's class, and it's also, I give this example a lot to people. I look around my own family, and people always say, well, where did you come from? And they expect that I'm going to have this mother who is baking, we had ragu sauce and spaghetti, and if my mom cooked it all, and my dad is a very much meat and potatoes person, and my sister is different, and my mom is still obsessed with low fat. And so it's different from person to person, even within families, and then it's different geographically, and then it's different class-wise. And I think that, if I took my father who, you know, as a fairly sophisticated guy to a restaurant where they served him a whole roasted carrot, I mean, he would stand up and walk out.
But I also don't think you can discount the importance of how food trends in this country. I mean, we're a very aspirational country in how we eat, and how food trends, you know, start at the top at good restaurants and then go down. So now you have someone like Dirk Candy, and journalists like food journalists are like, here's somebody who's doing really interesting things with vegetables in a cool restaurant in New York that we haven't seen before. It's delicious. It's different. I've never seen it. We write about it. And eventually this will trickle down. I mean, if you look, you know, the molten chocolate cake that now you can get at, you know, Arby's drive-through, like they have a, you know, our hot center, you know, that, or is it, maybe it's Arby's or it's...
I'm not sure, but
it's a fast, is it? It's Arby's. Thank you. This man knows everything. You know, and that started because Jean-Georges started making it, you know, in Manhattan 15 years ago.
Right, but molten chocolate cake and, you know, whole roasted carrots, it's a totally an easier sell.
You know, I mean, you know, Chipotle, that McDonald's has Chipotle mayonnaise, you know, like, or in their Chipotle mayonnaise wrap, but they're testing that. I mean, this starts with, you know, garlic roasted potatoes, you know, garlic and mashed potatoes started as a bistro in San Francisco and then ended up through the American sluice box of culture at Boston, you know, at Boston Market. I mean, American food industry is great at taking something somebody's kind of interested in, very high level, and then mass marketing it. And so I don't think you can discount that, even, you know, whether it's a roasted carrot or, you know, Brussels sprouts. I think, you know, I think these things will really trickle down fairly quickly. So our job is to go, at this very high, like the fancy art part of how we eat, culinary as art, we kind of write about that. We find, you know, we luckily, because of our jobs, can, you know, eat at those places and call up chefs, and we talk to people and we sort of see where the cutting edge is, write about that, because that's new and news. And then it trickles down, and then when it becomes, you know, molten chocolate cake at Arby's, we get to write about, look at America falling apart, molten chocolate cakes at Arby's. So, you know, we get an opportunity to write at many levels of that story. But again, as I said in this earlier panel, you know, we're just calling balls and strikes. We're just like, here's what's going on. This is not truthful. This is truthful. This is a twist in how people are eating. This is a twist in how people are cooking. You know, news, you know, we're not here to advocate, at least my newspaper does not pay me to advocate for a position. But we are, you know, I think advocates of the delicious and advocates of the truth. So that's about as far as,
so where those two things meet, the delicious and the truth. Right?
Where is the delicious and the truth? That's my job.
I like that, advocates of the delicious and the truth. But you still see a lot of, and I'm not saying you three specifically or your publication specifically, but you still see a lot of publications that do call out the price of a vegetable dish. I mean, when Northern Spy put a carrot dish for $18 on their menu, and they were the ones who really started the kale chip craze in New York, and that then has gone to retail markets, obviously. That made news. The fact that a carrot dish was $18 made news. So, and would you see a time when that's no longer news, or do you feel you have to point that out in stories, or do journalists feel they have to point out that, oh my God, it's priced as a chicken sandwich would be, or something like that, or can you sweep that under the rug a little bit to not create
I mean, at this point, I don't think you have to point that out. I think people understand that vegetables are cool enough, but I mean, at the same time, you know, I mean, it was, how much was the chicken at the Nomad? That was the big thing. You know,
right, or when Daniel...
It was like did the $36 burger.
Hamburger.
Or so it's sort of the first. I mean, you know, an $88 chicken, it's noteworthy. You know, I mean, I think you sort of know when something's noteworthy, but I don't think anyone's picking on vegetables. It's just sort of the first time somebody says, oh my God, here's a burger, which you're used to getting at the drive-thru, it's $32. You know, you're going to say that.
Right, and now look at us in this like incredible burger revolution. You know, when they started to kind of revamp the burger, you had a chef take this high-end burger, take this thing we all ate, made into a fancy food thing, and then now, you know, Danny Meyer is worth $600 million because the chefing up of burgers has happened. You know, that, you know, anything that, you know, you can get wealthy people to pay for, which seems ridiculous, and either it's going to fall out as ridiculous and not matter, or it will fall out and change culture.
Right.
And it just... You know.
So switching a little bit from these stories that, or chefs like Amanda or some of the chefs we've seen on stage here, I'm sure there are a lot of chefs in the audience who feel a little frustrated because they can't get your attention for the things that they are doing that they feel is good and is interesting and is as valuable as a celebrity chef in a New York or San Francisco restaurant. And I'm not talking about, should they send you press releases? I'm not talking about the technical aspect, but how can these stories that are not based on celebrity personalities capture your attention?
I don't know. Sometimes those are better. I mean, I think it goes back to being something that's truly interesting and perhaps links up with trends that are happening elsewhere, so you can start to connect the dots and say, hey, there's something really here. This small restaurant in Chicago is doing X, and in Dallas they're doing X. I mean, for our paper, I very much like it when things are happening outside of New York City.
Right.
It can't just be happening in Brooklyn. We aren't going to write about it. My editor will say no. So you need there to be little, which I think is happening more and more now. Food culture is changing, and the way these trends bubble up is different. So it's just about, I think, having a genuinely interesting story about how the chef got to that place. Why did you go there? What informed you? How are customers reacting? Are they reacting in some interesting way? And do you see some reference of it, some echo of it in some other way that makes it a little bit bigger than just yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the outside of New York is a great thing, and I think it, the problem is that, as trends trickle down, if they start let's just pick on Brooklyn, fine. But if they start in Brooklyn and then someone emails you and they say, I'm getting, I have a garden out back too, and you're thinking, what am I supposed to do with this? It's totally derivative. But what I would be interested in knowing is, it doesn't even have to be a story. It's like, you know what? We used to sell, every night we used to sell 30 steaks a night. And now, and for the last 3 Saturday nights, we sold 3 in Cleveland or in Wichita or in Dallas or in anywhere, it would just be interesting. So there's something, you're not a celebrity chef, but you're like, hey, here's what's happening in the restaurants of America. Here's where the trends are going. So I think that's a really good way to do it. It can be just information that's put in context. It doesn't have to be that you're a celebrity, because, I'm sick of celebrity chefs. I don't know if everyone else is, so thank you.
Do you want to answer that?
I think what's happening in your own neighborhood is always a good story. And I just was thinking about this. We were trying to talk about whether Midwest food is a thing and as if it's having its moment. And is it, like whitefish and, like what's happening around the Great Lakes? Or is it more, I talked to a guy who was making the charcuterie thing. If somebody tells me they have a great charcuterie program now, I'm like, next. I can't take any more of the charcuterie. I'm sure charcuterie is great and people are doing their own salami and I'm happy to eat it, but it's not really a story. But there was a guy in North Dakota who was working on some bison salami that was kind of interesting. And then I'm like, well, how are these? Is that a Midwest thing, or are there Midwest regions, or in your own community, are you cooking things from that area that has some reference to the past or a historical or a story behind it? Is there a particular wave of immigration that's now changed how you're cooking your food? All those sorts of things are interesting. Where I find this in Atlanta a lot is there's this looking over your shoulder among a lot of the chefs at what New York or what San Francisco's doing. And so there's this kind of derivative, poorly executed, not that interesting, food that they're doing that is trying to echo what the trends are in New York. And I'm always interested in somebody's cooking from where they are and from that sense of place and the stories that are more authentic. And the food is, you had these ladies who made pierogies all the time, so now you've come up with a great pierogi recipe and people are, eating it like crazy, and you've found the one, you spent all your time searching the one grandmother who really knew how to make it, and now you've given it a twist, and because you have, immigrants from this particular other country, you've mixed it, like whatever that story is for you as a cook is really interesting to me.
I will also, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, trust me, they're glad you did. So
I will also say that I love a good, there's a problem with a supply of an ingredient story or pricing story. You notice
Chipotle
that
doesn't have carnitas. Why?
Yeah,
See, there
Chipotle
you go.
doesn't. Mussels, you know, it was a cold winter and there's no mussels and we can't get any mussels.
The process
Lobsters,
killed all
there's
the
too many of
peaches.
them, and
Yeah.
you know, now we're using them in everything. All these kind of like the realities of how you have to price something. You know, we can't get this week, and I know that the guy down the street at the restaurant is doing the same thing. Those are great journal stories. We write those all the time. Or things like we wrote stories about, you know, getting rid of the bread basket. People don't want bread baskets anymore. Instead, we're doing fancy butter. Those have nothing to do with being sort of, you know, I'm a celebrity chef. Those are the realities of sort of, this is what people want when they come to the restaurant. This is the business of the restaurant. All that stuff is fascinating to me.
You know, like restaurants offering, sparkling water, like doing their own systems for sparkling water is kind of an interesting thing. And should you charge for that or not? And all those little twists on how you run your restaurant business are interesting.
So should restaurateurs and food service operators be more revealing about what's going on behind the scene and those types of questions, the sort of the dirty part of the business?
Yes.
Totally.
We love dirt.
Yeah.
You know, if you can't, you know, when in Georgia, when they were passing some pretty strict and scary immigration laws, all the kitchens in town suddenly were empty. Like, because people literally were like packing up and moving their families because there was a real sense that they were going to get picked up off the street at any time. And so, you know, restaurant people say, look, we are having a really tough time getting any, you know, maybe as a restaurateur, you don't want anybody to know that you can't have any, you don't have any help in the back. But on the other hand, that's a really interesting story that's affecting your industry, and how are you going to deal with it, you know? LA's got a big thing going on now around tipping, and, you know, the cost of, a lot of restaurants want to go to a service model for tipping, and LA City Council's now doing trying to stop that, and it's an interesting restaurant industry story that is, I think, worth telling.
I did a story for WNYC a couple of years ago that was about how chefs in New York were having a hard time getting line cooks because it was for a local radio station. So the idea was, listen, you know, people don't want to cook in New York, and the answer was, well, they can go to Portland, Maine, or they can go to, you know, Durham, North Carolina, or they can go, and for the amount of money they earn, they can actually live a life instead of living with 6 people in a walk-up. Why, you know, there's no point, you don't have to be in New York anymore. I mean, that was kind of a big deal there, you know, and it was shown through the fact that a restaurateur friend of mine was complaining that he couldn't find anybody to work, and neither could anybody else. So I think those lead to kind of interesting stories.
That's not a beautiful piece on your kitchen and the great culinary skills that you have that I'm sure many people would rather us write about, but it sort of shows you where the interest is for us in terms of what we put in our publications. But then sometimes, you know, really beautiful food that somebody's cooking is a great thing for us.
Or sometimes we illustrate those stories with beautiful cooking pictures, even though it's because we also like those in the paper.
So how much do you trust chefs when it comes to nutrition, sustainability, food policy? Because they have been put in situations of being spokespeople for those issues and being trusted sources, as they're such an intermediary between consumers and the government or farmers, et cetera, et cetera. But the information is not always necessarily accurate, or is it? Or what filters or what radars do you have up when you're talking to a chef about nutrition, sustainability, policy, et cetera?
I mean, I tend to not, I mean, I don't think you can generalize. I mean, if I could ask Michel Nishan about sustainability, or, you know, I believe anything that man says. So, but, you know, I mean, on nutrition, I tend to trust them a lot less. You know, I'm talking about chefs in small restaurants who, you know, realize that a lot of things taste a lot better with butter and cream in them, and I don't want to know about what's in that. I want to just go and enjoy my meal. But I think it really depends, and, you know, what I would say about, it isn't a question of trust, it's a question of, if you are a chef who wants to be up and talking about that, please go do your homework, because you undercut yourself if you make a mistake. And it was funny, I was talking to this guy who's the chef at this restaurant called Egg in Brooklyn, and he's very interested in sustainability, and he's very committed to these issues, and he said that he was going to one of these James Beard boot camps, and I thought, why are you going to the James Beard boot camp? You know, surely this should be for somebody who's really new to these issues, you know, not someone who's, you know, not preaching to the choir. And his answer to me was, you know, I still don't know how to talk about it. and I still don't know how to, like, I didn't know what a policy ask was. And that, you know, he was very interested in it, but had this lens through which he was looking at it, and he had sort of been able to take what he was doing at the restaurant and be able to frame it in different ways. And so I was like, oh, well, great. You see, I was completely wrong about that. But so I think it's that kind of thing. If you're not really, just because you're a chef and you cook food doesn't mean you should be talking about those things. And so if you're going to be talking about those things, you need to know what you're talking about.
I think chefs, it's tough these days because so many people, I mean, even if you look at the slides we saw before, if a chef is telling somebody about their food, they're more likely to eat it if it's better. Like if that, I mean, chefs, so not only do we expect a chef to be there, you know, it's that whole collapsing again of culture. So chefs are going to tell us about our food, and I'm going to take the recommendation for that. Chefs are being put upon now to talk about food policy. They're needing to know everything in their supply chain about which farms are, you know, doing the right environmental practices. They need to know about labor issues and are expected to sort of be leaders on that. And I talk to chefs who feel like once they get to a certain level, they need to have some sort of a foundation or some kind of charitable arm so that then, you know, when everybody's coming to them for asks to give food to certain causes, they have at least their pet cause that then they can just say, I'm putting my money toward that. So it's a lot of pressure on people who just wanted to cook, you know. It's like, it's a lot. But I think there's no denying that the outpouring of our initial celebrity chef, you know, explosion, which I think that star is sort of fading in a way. There's like TV chefs now, and then there's chefs that we look to for leadership as like the groups are separating. I think there's a lot on chefs. And, you know, I kind of cringe every time I hear Tom Colicchio going off about GMOs because I think he's not always correct, or he's very much an advocate, but people, now he's like being like kind of a faux news reporter, Tom Colicchio, on some, like, you know, I mean, I'm not sure, I mean, Tom's great, whatever, but I'm not sure how much he actually is factual or knows. So again, there's nothing worse than a chef who doesn't know what he or she is talking about, trying to sort of spout off on all their views on, you know, it gets really fudgy around the edges for me. So I tend to, unless I feel like a chef's really researched that because they want to get the best fish that's sustainable in their seafood restaurant, and they've really thought a lot about it, and they talk to the fishermen, and they know that, I mean, that's great, then that person knows their stuff. But if there's some, you know, it's just because it's the, you know, politically correct position of the day for a chef to have, and they don't really have much background on it, it's just really kind of painful to listen to that. But I feel for chefs right now. They're really in a unique position in society and have to be spokespeople. And it's interesting that State Department now has this culinary diplomacy thing where they're taking chefs to the State Department and training them to, and then they're in Milan now. A lot of them are going and doing, you know, having to talk. And the fact that our U.S. government is paying money to train chefs to do diplomatic work is kind of fascinating to me. I mean, we really are in a moment with the position of chefs in our culture, I think.
So taking the responsibility off of chefs, how much responsibility do you have as media? Because a lot of the chefs get their information from reading you, right, and you're interpreting studies and things like that. So how do you learn about policy nutrition? Should we trust you? I mean, there was just an example of a fake chocolate study. I don't know if you guys read that. I think a journalist created a fake study about the health benefits of chocolate and decided to test it. And it went viral with publications all over saying, here is this latest study on chocolate. Here is why you should eat chocolate. It's amazing. And obviously people repeat that type of information. It was a complete fake thing, completely created. So how do you educate yourself? What is your responsibility to create and write material, not to create, but to write and report material that others can then use as sources?
I don't believe that study showed up in either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times.
Of course not.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been in this business so long, I'll tell you. But I feel like,
do you want to steal Lucy's
studies come and studies go, right? And so, and certainly and we have a fairly high bar. We have people at the paper who are science writers. I'm not a science writer, but who really understand how to read a study and see if it makes sense or not. But it's like, oatmeal is good and oatmeal is bad, and this is good and this is bad, and we have to eat margarine, and margarine's bad. So when there's really significant scientific data that is really moving the needle in some way. Part of that is having good sources in public health departments and at universities who I could call up and go, have you heard about this? Does this make sense? Or is anybody else talking about this? Or is this really an important one or not? You know, some of that is just vetting it with people I know and trust, or calling people I know in the science department. I say this, I'm mentioning the study, and then they'll ask me all the things to look at in terms of how it was done and peer review and where did it publish, and even then there's mistakes. But there are a whole lot of people doing a lot of science every day that, you know, the nutrient study that comes out that they're going to present to the USDA that the Dairy Council funded, well, so now we're, you know, that's going to get in the USDA guidelines because the Dairy Fund, you know, now we have to have a cup of milk or more yolk. Like, all that's very suspicious, and you have to kind of understand how that process works and have a bit of a raised eyebrow about any study that comes in. So it's incumbent upon us to do our homework really well and know who to go to talk to say, does this make sense? And that's our job, you know, that's what we do.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, yeah, that is our job. That is our responsibility.
That's what I spend
Very
a lot
much
of my
so.
time doing. So,
But I
so
also
we hope you
think-
can trust us.
Oh, I was just going to say,
Yeah,
I
so
also
yes, you
think
can
like
trust
I think you can, but you know, first of all, the science also evolves, and then you know, I mean, the stories I wrote about grass-fed beef 8 years ago are different than the stories I read about now, because now everybody's concerned about water, and nobody was asking about water before, and so I'm taking different things into consideration when I you know, find myself all of a sudden being a food writer, and people want me to have answers about drought and water, and you know, I mean, I have to educate myself. So I mean, you know, the stories I wrote on GMOs 5 years ago I would probably cringe at now, because having written it so many, you know, I do know more to ask. I am more skeptical about certain things, or you know, whatever. So I think that clearly we do the best that we can. We know what to look for. We know what to be skeptical about. But I mean, the deeper you get into a subject, the better you can do it.
And we're generalists, you know, and we're writing the first draft of history, and we're writing, you know, what do you need to know today, you know, and so again, like your point is well taken. Things evolve, you know, which is why you have to be very careful when you're, you know, writing about any scientific breakthroughs and have a raised eyebrow. But it's, you know, we're in the daily news business, and you know, things change day to day. And I like to think I don't think I've had any outright, this study was like, I can't believe we thought of.
It was a fake chocolate study.
I don't think
That
I've
has
had the
never
fake
happened.
chocolate study. Got knock on
Knock on
Never
wood
seen
again,
that.
yeah. So, I mean, obviously the three of you are probably the most trusted voices indeed when it comes to these issues. What are things that other media, and we won't name
All right, we're
names,
done
do that make you cringe when it comes to sustainability issues, to the work of chefs around sustainability?
What do we hate to see in other media when it comes to sustainability?
Whether it's a topic, it's a way of talking about a topic. What
Well, I think for me, you know, I'm somebody who, this may be a positive or negative, but sort of I like the grays and the complexities, and so I just get really annoyed when it's like, this is right, you know, and this is eat grass-fed beef, or eat, you know, first we picked on Brooklyn, now we're picking on grass-fed beef, you know, but I mean, just as an example, I mean, I think these things are extremely complicated, and, you know, quite often it depends what you're comparing it to. So that's my new question, is sort of, you know, is it better than what? I mean, there's X amount of omega-3s in grass-fed beef, but you could eat one bite of salmon and get that much more. So should you really be eating grass-fed beef over a corn-fed beef if you're worried about omega-3s? No. So, you know, I think those are the kinds of things that really frustrate me, these sort of definitive silver bullet, black and whites, because as anybody who deals with this knows, it's really not that simple. And I know it doesn't make quite as exciting a headline, but maybe that's why I've always been a terrible headline writer. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a certain stridency that really exhausts me around
Yes.
food. And a very, you know, it's so personal for people if you're not, you know,
You're with us or
you know, and
against
I
us.
understand that the food system is broken in lots of ways, and we have big health problems related to food, and we have big class problems related to food, and you know, people who come along and instantly think they have the big idea that's going to fix it, which is that, you know, screw Monsanto, man, and this is how can you, you know, it's sort of the way of the world forever, and part of what we're in is this process of trying to change it slowly and change it from the plate and, individual discussion. And I think that's what there's some really good work that gets done in that real advocacy journalism, like Civil Eats, I think, does some good stuff, but I also think that I'm always a bit skeptical just because of the point of view is so strong, and they go out with their goal is to go and filter out everything else and support their thesis, which oftentimes is really good and right, and the tomato pickers are really getting screwed in Florida. I don't disagree with that, and but wading through that, I never feel like I have like the other side, okay, well, there's an industry that everybody wants a tomato on their plate, and so how are people going to pay more? It's just not, like you say, it's not nuanced enough. So I think there's really good and increasingly good advocacy food journalism that I read and learn things from, but it pains me that people take that as gospel, and I think there's a lot increasing more of that. And if you've seen Food Inc., and I just, like, people at a cocktail party, I hate telling them what I do for a living because I just have to hear this, barrage of how screwed up the food system is, and that I should be writing about how evil Monsanto is every day. And, I tell people I sell insurance and they leave me alone. It's better.
Well, and so related to that, and this question of complexity, one of the big, and I don't want to get into the GMO discussion, we'll save that for another Menus of Change, but one of the big headline-grabbing story right now is all these companies that one after the other are saying, I'm not using GMO anymore. And so that's a very, very simple story, but every time one big company does that, it gets in the news. So do you ever think, well, I'm not going to write about this because ultimately it's not, it's
depends how
simplified.
big it is. I mean, think about Cheerios, right? That was a big one because it's Cheerios.
Well, and because it was the first thing you ever give your kid.
And it's this iconic thing. Right. It's given to kids. For me, the reason that is so interesting and should be written about is because that means that the issue, regardless of what you think of it, has gotten to a certain level where General Mills feels that it will help them sell cereal to put it on the box. I mean, and that's a societal moment. Yeah. That's the story. And so big matters with these things, regardless of what you think about the details of GMO and what's right and what isn't. When a big company reacts, that means that something's happening with us, and that's fascinating to me.
Right. I mean, the reaction and this is probably going to get us all into trouble at this point, but so Panera is going to get its artificial ingredients out, right? But if you look at the whole of the Panera menu and where the meat's sourced from and what's the condition of, there's a lot that's, you could argue that, but Panera get a big bang for doing that because they're such a big company, and then Taco Bell's trying to get on it. And reality, if you looked really at what food, where the stuff is coming from, how the animals are being treated in the ham that's in those Panera sandwiches, there could be a lot to go after, but Panera got great publicity on that. But why was that? Why was that a news story that Panera is going to take its artificial ingredients out of some of its, menu? That was a kind of a move the needle that got written about.
Yeah,
but why do you think that was such a good story?
I don't know. I think
I didn't write it.
I didn't write about it either. But maybe
it's Cheerios GMO moment? Is it?
I don't know. My sense is Panera has been held up as sort of this new kind of restaurant that's doing well, and so there's some interest in how are it's the Chipotle.
Yeah, they're also certain. There's the
effect.
Chipotle thing. I mean, anything Chipotle does, and there's the halo effect there, and then when they do it, then everybody reads it, and so it sort of starts a snowball in a way.
It's genius in how fast it can turn on this stuff sometimes, which is why it's so funny. It's taken them 15 years to get trans fat out of it, but when they want to, they can turn fast, and then it's of course up to us as journalists to go.
Turning that fast.
Well, exactly. You're right. It's not like, oh my God, God bless Panera. It's all healthy food.
It's taken them a long time to do this. They announced this, I think, a year and a half ago. Right. They're still working on it. So they're.
And then it's incumbent on us, the journalists, to go really like somebody in a year or in 6 months go and take a bunch of samples of Panera's food to a lab and see if there are any artificial ingredients into it. That's our job,
it's
maybe.
Like the sustainable beef story. I can't remember exactly what the promise was from McDonald's in 2004. They got all this press that they were going to switch to Of course, now I can't remember
It
exactly.
could have been cage-free eggs. No.
It was something, and then like they just never did it. And then there was what struck me was that then they made this big announcement about it a year or two ago. And so I this is yet another story I didn't write, but my friend Andy Martin at Bloomberg did, and it was.
I love Andy Martin.
I
by the way.
know. But I called him up and I said, why? I said they already announced this 10 years ago, and so he did the story. About how they had made this big announcement and what the impact was going to be, because, by the way, they said they were going to do it 10 years ago and they never did it, which was great. Unfortunately, unless you're at a Bloomberg terminal.
Yeah, I mean, we need to follow up better. When
Yeah,
we
that's
do
what
write
we've
about big companies that do these things, and this is something that we can certainly do better, I think, as journalists, is follow up 6 months later when it's not a headline anymore and see did they in fact do it, and not fall into the spin.
Yeah.
And I think we
There's
tend
not
to,
a lot
because
of
we move
incentive
on, because
for
there's
those
always a new
stories.
story
Yeah.
coming at us. There's always a chef who wants us to get their story in the paper, and that's on a daily basis coming at us. And so, the discipline to go back and to really mark a story and say, I need to go back in 6 months or a year and see if this in fact happened, because that's a good story. It's something I know I think about doing better all the time. So
They teach you that in journalism school, but it's hard to do it.
they also teach you, even if your mother says she loves you, you better check it out.
Well, and it is a little scary because you are journalists with resources to do that type of follow-up in a way that smaller publication or websites don't necessarily have. So if you're saying it's challenging for you to do it, it's a little bit frightening for.
Well, but we're also big general, these bigger general publications. There actually are a lot of really great smaller, like some of these advocacy journalist organizations, and just strictly online, ProPublica, these places that are really doing some of that great work. We may be the journals of popular culture in a way, or some really good basic news reporting. We're the Cheerios of news reporting, or what, like we're. But there's some, I think, increasingly, and this is what's kind of the beauty, how fast things are changing in technology and how we get information, is that there are some really good little Davids out there who are doing stories I always wished that I had done. So I think it's actually not as scary as it seems. It's actually, I think, better, because I think there's all these young journalists who can't, there aren't that many small papers, there aren't many papers anymore to work for, and they're going into these new, really exciting areas, doing this advocacy kind of journalism that I think is making, is keeping us honest and keeping food companies honest. I don't know. I feel more bullish on that.
I think if you're a company, you feel much more watched than you did.
Yeah, man. It's
10 years ago.
Absolutely.
And you know that Twitter can kill you. They're very aware of that, I think. That's a different game for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to be really transparent, because it's the lie, the cover-up that'll screw you up right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So, because not enough people will approach you at the reception, what is the story you wish you could write right now?
And do we want to talk about
Yeah,
it
I was like, I'm
publicly?
not telling you.
I would like to write that Michelle Obama is
Competition is
really
an
a
issue.
transgender man.
I
you
feel
mean
like
a food
that's
story.
like a no. Wait,
Okay.
don't tell me.
If someone in the audience may have details to add to the story you wish to
Yeah.
write, that might be better, but you never know. You never know who's sitting here.
Right. I don't know. God, what story do I want to write? I don't.
Or that you wish are there stories you wish you could, but you can't write? Or
Well, I've always wanted to do, actually, to plug the CIA, and it brings up what Kim was saying before. I was at a CIA World of Flavor conference 5, 6, 7 years ago, I don't even know, and it was the street food conference, so someone here probably knows when that was. And I thought, I want to do a story about how this ends up at Applebee's, or how this ends up at whatever, and just sort of the trickle down, and how that actually works. But it takes a couple years, and so, by the time I left Words of Flavor and written I remembered it, but it was hard. It wasn't like a story I could really see how it ended up at legal. I remember talking to the legal seafoods people who were there, and I said, well, what are you going to do with this, and how's it, and like, what do you have to do to figure out how to make it work? So I've never successfully done that from here to there story.
And one thing I really am trying to get my arms around more is understanding the seafood, and how every once in a while I come across a little story about poached, not cooked poached, but like stolen poached seafood. It's a tough audience. Like, poached seafood. They're like, oh, I poach it all the time. But how, the sort of underground bootleg seafood system works, and I know a lot of chefs will get stuff over the transom that, you know, we had some guys busted with a ton of redfish in North Carolina, you know, and it was like 600, they had a lot of redfish. They weren't supposed to be fishing. But I think there's a lot of that goes on. And I think the whole seafood market thing is really interesting. The imported seafood, like what we're really eating with seafood, we know probably the least about. And that is one area that I am trying to learn more about. So if any of you all have some good deep-throaty seafood stuff to tell me. Don't tell her.
I think sort of big topic that I like to chip away at, and I'm always looking for new ways to do that, is how big food companies are adjusting to the fact that their bread and butter products are not doing well. And that's where they still get that's their big volume sales base is, you know, the canned soup, the soda, the box cereal. That's a big shift. That's a big shift for grocery stores. That's a big shift down the whole chain of how food is sold in much of America. And so I'm always looking for sort of how is that affecting the company? What is the next step? Is there some way that grocery stores are dealing with? There's some new wrinkle in that whole big story I find fascinating.
I'm also always interested in the psychology of the supermarket and the psychology of menu writing and how you get people to order certain things off your menu, or the way that grocery stores have redesigned themselves, and that whole battle for the shelf space thing. I think that's just a fascinating cutthroat business,
Shockingly cutthroat.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's a good story.
Well,
Give me 3,000 words on that.
you will find Jane, Sarah, and Kim at separate corners of the reception, I imagine, so you can whisper your stories to them.
Right.
If any of you pitch them a story that talks about how a CIA conference has had a trickle-down effect, I will personally put you in touch with them and buy you a drink in the process. Thank you so much to the three of you. This was really great. Thank you for helping us understand what to do better. And now I invite you all to go outside to the beverage garden for the reception, and we will see you back here at 8 o'clock for breakfast tomorrow morning. They're shutting the lights down on us right away. Thank you.
Really good.
God, thank you.
Relentless on the questioning. I appreciate it.
I love doing that. Thank you.